A man can ride 1,000 miles to escape his past, but ghosts ride alongside him the whole way. Daniel Stone pressed his Mustang forward through the Wyoming blizzard, his breath crystallizing in air so cold it burned his lungs. December 23rd, 1889 had come early to the territory, and it had come hard. Snow whipped across the landscape in sheets of white fury, erasing the boundaries between earth and sky, turning the world into a canvas of endless winter. His horse's hooves found purchase on the frozen ground beneath, each step deliberate and measured, carrying him further from Austin, Texas, and the memories that haunted him there. 4 years, 4 winters since he'd walked away from everything that mattered. At 34, Daniel had already buried more dreams than most men twice his age. 4 years of running, always running, because standing still meant remembering. And remembering meant feeling the hollow space where his heart used to beat, where Margaret's laughter once echoed and Anna's small hands used to find his when nightmares came calling. The Colt 45 on his hip felt heavier than usual today, the weight of it pressed against his thigh with each movement of the horse, a familiar burden that had once meant justice and order, but now felt like just another reminder of failures. The Winchester rifle in his saddle scabbard seemed to mock him with its unused weight, the metal cold even through the leather wrapping he'd added during a particularly harsh winter in Colorado. Once, these tools had meant something. Once, when the silver star on his chest had caught the Texas sun, and people looked at him with respect instead of pity. Texas Ranger, they'd called him. Daniel Stone, the man who brought order to chaos, justice to the lawless. The man who could track an outlaw across 3 counties, who never backed down from a fight when right was on his side. That was before diphtheria came to Austin like a thief in the night, creeping through the streets with silent steps and deadly breath. Before it took Margaret's gentle laugh and Anna's bright eyes, her small voice that used to sing made-up songs about horses and rainbows and futures that would never come. Before it left him standing in an empty house that echoed with phantom voices, holding a badge that meant nothing when it couldn't protect the only people who mattered. He'd burned the house, stood in the yard and watched the flames consume the rocking chair where Margaret used to sing Anna to sleep, watched his daughter's wooden toys turn to ash and smoke. The neighbors had tried to stop him, said he was grief mad, but they didn't understand. That house held too many ghosts, too many moments of happiness that would only torture him if he tried to live among them. Then he'd saddled his Mustang, the same horse that had carried him through countless dangers and now carried him through a different kind of hell, and ridden north. He'd carried nothing but grief and the clothes on his back and a determination never again to care enough about anything that losing it could break him. Colorado first, where he'd worked as a deputy in a mining town whose name he'd already forgotten. Then Nebraska, hunting rustlers for a cattle baron who paid well and asked no questions about a man's past. After that, the Dakotas, where the winters were harsh enough to freeze even memories, or so he'd hoped. But the memories followed him everywhere, riding alongside like a companion he couldn't shake. Margaret's face in every sunset, Anna's laughter in every child's voice he heard from a distance, the weight of love lost and the fear that he might someday be foolish enough to risk that kind of pain again. Cheyenne waited ahead, maybe 2 days hard riding in this weather if the storm broke soon. The territorial capital needed men with his skills, men willing to wear a badge and face down the kind of trouble that came with rapid growth and easy money. Gold and silver brought people, and people brought problems, and problems needed solving by men who understood that sometimes justice came at the end of a gun. It would be just another place to exist without living. Another town where he could rent a room above a saloon and spend his evenings cleaning his weapons and his days enforcing laws that protected other people's happiness, while his own remained buried in a grave back in Texas. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying something unexpected through the howl of winter's fury. A sound that didn't belong to the storm's symphony, crying. Children's voices, thin and desperate, cutting through the blizzard's roar like knife blades through canvas. Daniel reined in his Mustang, squinting through the driving snow. His horse shook its head, ice crystals forming on its mane, breath steaming in great clouds that the wind immediately tore away. There, maybe 50 yards to his left, stood a weathered fence line, cedar posts connected by rails that had seen better seasons, marking the boundary of what looked like a homestead claim. 160 acres, If the posts were regulation spacing according to the Homestead Act, the kind of spread the government promised to any man brave enough or desperate enough to try making something from nothing in this harsh country. The posts were good quality cedar, resistant to rot, placed with the kind of precision that spoke of careful planning and high hopes for the future. Behind the fence, smoke rose from a modest cabin. Someone had stoked a fire this morning, made this place warm against winter's bite. The smoke was gray-white and steady, the kind that came from seasoned wood burned by people who knew how to make a fire last, how to conserve fuel when the nearest supply might be days away. But two small figures stood at the fence line itself, gripping the rails with small hands despite the bitter cold. Their breath formed tiny clouds in the air, and their stance spoke of desperate determination, as if they'd been waiting in this spot for hours or days, or perhaps their entire lives. Twin girls, maybe 7 years old, wearing matching coats that had been mended too many times. The fabric showed the careful hand of someone who knew how to make things last, patches sewn with love, if not with abundance. They didn't wave at his approach. They didn't call out or run away, as most children might when confronted by a stranger on horseback. They simply stood there, gripping those fence rails, watching him with the kind of focused attention that spoke of purpose beyond their years. Daniel's horse stopped without command. The animal simply halted as if it too recognized a moment that demanded stillness. Some instinct older than training, telling it that this was a place where important things happened, where the current of a life might change direction entirely. The girls spoke in unison, their voices cutting through the frozen air like church bells calling the faithful to prayer. "Please, mister, be our daddy today." Time seemed to crystallize around those words, each syllable hanging in the air like ice formations on a cliff face. Daniel stared at these children whose faces were identical mirrors of hope and desperation. Same button noses reddened by cold and wind. Same brown eyes enormous with something that looked like certainty, as if they'd known he was coming long before he'd known it himself. Same absolute faith that he was the answer to some prayer he hadn't heard them make. The girl on the left, slightly taller and more animated, bounced on her toes despite the cold. Her mittened hands gripped the fence rail with white-knuckled determination, and her eyes held the bright intensity of someone who believed in the power of wishes and the goodness of strangers. "We asked God for a Christmas wish," she continued, her breath forming tiny clouds that the wind caught and scattered. "Then you came riding up, just like in the stories Mama tells us about angels." The other girl, quieter but no less intense, simply stared at him with eyes that seemed older than her years. She didn't speak, but her gaze held him with the weight of expectation, as if she could will him into being what they needed through the sheer force of wanting it. Daniel's chest tightened with something that felt like panic. These children saw salvation where there was only a broken man running from ghosts. They saw a father where there was only someone who'd failed at fatherhood so completely that God had taken his chance away forever. Behind them, the cabin's door burst open with a bang that echoed across the snowy yard. A woman rushed out, shawl clutched around her shoulders with one hand while the other pressed against her chest as if trying to contain her heart. Her face carried the kind of mortification that came from children saying exactly what they thought in front of exactly the wrong person. She was young, maybe 29, with dark hair that had escaped its pins during her rush from the cabin. The wind caught the loose strands and whipped them around a face that showed both strength and exhaustion. The kind of bone-deep weariness that came from carrying too much responsibility for too long. Her eyes were the color of winter steel, gray-blue and direct, meeting his gaze without flinching, despite her obvious embarrassment. Her cheeks burned red, and not just from the cold. This was a woman who valued propriety and dignity, who would be horrified at her children's forwardness with a stranger. "Girls, get inside this instant!" She reached them in seconds despite the snow, her movements quick and sure. Daniel watched her hands as they grasped her daughter's shoulders with gentle firmness, noting the calluses that spoke of hard work and harder choices. These weren't the soft hands of a woman who waited for others to solve her problems. These were the hands of someone who split her own kindling and mended her own fences and probably loaded her own shotgun when necessary. Her dress was simple wool, dark blue and practical, with the kind of careful mending that spoke of making do rather than making new. But it was clean and pressed, and she wore it with a dignity that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with self-respect. "I'm so sorry, sir," she said, her voice carrying the weight of genuine mortification. "They don't understand what they're asking. Please forgive them." "But Mama," the more animated twin protested, her mittened hand still gripping the fence rail, as if letting go would somehow release her hold on hope itself. "You said we could ask God for anything at Christmas. You said if we were good and if we prayed hard enough, maybe he'd send us what we needed most." "That's not what I meant, Emma." The woman's voice cracked like ice under pressure, and Daniel heard something in it that made him look more closely at her face. Exhaustion, yes, but something deeper. The kind of weariness that came from having hope disappointed too many times, from learning that the world was harder than children believed, and that sometimes prayers went unanswered no matter how desperately they were offered. She glanced at Daniel, and in that brief moment of eye contact, he saw something that stopped his planned retreat before it could begin. Not desperation, though there was some of that. Not manipulation or calculation. What he saw was dignity. The quiet dignity of someone who had learned to carry burdens too heavy for her shoulders and refused to let them break her spine. "Please forgive them," she continued, straightening her shoulders in a gesture Daniel recognized from his own mirror during those first awful months after the funeral. The conscious decision to stand tall when everything inside wanted to crumble. Their father passed 2 winters back, and every Christmas morning they pray for something that can't be given. She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't say the words aloud, but Daniel understood. They prayed for their father to come back, for their family to be whole again, for someone to fill the empty space at their table and in their lives. The other twin, the quiet one, tugged her mother's skirt with one small hand while keeping her eyes fixed on Daniel. "But he stopped, Mama," she said softly, her voice carrying a certainty that seemed to surprise even her. "He heard us and he stopped. That means something, doesn't it?" The woman closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, something had shifted. The mortification was still there, but it had been joined by resignation and perhaps the faintest flicker of hope that she was trying very hard to suppress. "I'm Martha Brennan," she said, her voice steady now, controlled. "I apologize for my daughter's forwardness. They meant no harm." "No harm taken, ma'am." Daniel's voice sounded rusty even to himself, roughened by disuse and emotion he didn't want to acknowledge. He didn't talk much these days, had learned that words led to connections, and connections led to caring. And caring led to the kind of loss that could break a man in half and leave the pieces scattered across a lifetime of regret. But something about this woman's dignity, about the way she held herself despite obvious embarrassment and exhaustion, made him want to offer something more than the cold dismissal he'd planned. Martha straightened her spine further, and Daniel saw steel beneath the exhaustion. This was a woman who'd been bent but not broken, who'd learned to bear whatever burdens life handed her without complaint or self-pity. "Please," she said, her voice careful and formal, "let me offer you breakfast. As an apology for my daughter's behavior. You must be cold, and it's Christmas morning. I can't let you ride on without something warm in your belly." Daniel should refuse. The word no formed on his tongue, ready to cut clean through this moment and let him ride back into the safe emptiness of solitude. He'd learned the hard way that kindness was dangerous, that accepting hospitality meant accepting connection, and connection meant making himself vulnerable as to the kind of pain that had already nearly destroyed him once. But before he could speak, the quiet twin stepped closer to the fence. "Emma," Martha had called the other one, so this must be the second daughter. She looked up at him with eyes that seemed to see straight through all his defenses to the hollow place where his heart used to beat. "Please, Mr. Cowboy," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Just breakfast. Mama makes good biscuits, and we have eggs from our own chickens. And it's Christmas, and Christmas is supposed to be about family and kindness and not being alone. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't riding into danger with guns blazing and righteous anger burning in your chest. Sometimes the bravest thing is staying put when every instinct screams at you to run, when the prospect of human connection feels more dangerous than any outlaw or wild animal." Daniel heard himself say, "Just breakfast. Much obliged, ma'am." He dismounted, his legs stiff from cold and hours in the saddle. The Mustang snorted, breath steaming in great clouds, as Daniel worked the reins with fingers that felt clumsy in the cold. As he tied the horse to the fence post, he heard Emma whisper to her sister with excitement that made his chest ache. "See, Kate, he stayed. I told you he would stay, if we asked nice enough." The words pierced him like winter wind through thin wool, sharp and unexpected. He almost untied the horse right then, almost swung back up into the saddle and rode hard toward the horizon where safety waited in the form of solitude and emotional numbness. But Martha was already herding the girls toward the cabin, and the door stood open, firelight and warmth spilling out into the cold morning like an invitation he wasn't sure he had the strength to refuse. Daniel took a breath that burned his lungs and tasted of snow and regret and possibilities he didn't dare acknowledge. Just breakfast, he told himself. Just warmth and food, and maybe an hour of pretending that human kindness wasn't the most dangerous thing in the world. Then he'd ride on, back to the safety of not caring, back to the familiar emptiness that couldn't break his heart, because he'd already broken it himself. He stepped through the door. The interior of the cabin hit Daniel like a physical blow, not because of any luxury or grandeur, but because of what it represented. Home. The concept he'd been running from for 4 years. The idea that 4 walls and a roof could contain something more valuable than any gold strike or cattle fortune. The space was small but meticulously organized, every inch planned and purposeful in the way of people who understood that waste was a luxury they couldn't afford. One main room served multiple functions, with sleeping alcoves carved from the corners and separated by curtains that had been sewn from matching fabric, probably cut from the same bolt to make every yard count. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, the firebox built with local river rock that had been carefully selected and fitted. The flames cast dancing shadows across scrubbed wooden floors that showed the wear patterns of daily life, but gleamed with the kind of cleanliness that spoke of pride rather than mere necessity. The table dominated the center of the room, handcrafted from what looked like local pine, its surface marked by years of use but polished to a warm glow. It was set for 3 with mismatched plates that had been carefully arranged, each piece placed with the kind of attention that turned a simple meal into something approaching ceremony. Martha quickly added a 4th setting, the movement so practiced it spoke of frequent unexpected guests, of the kind of frontier hospitality that had kept communities alive in harsh country where neighbors might be the difference between survival and death. Everything in the cabin showed careful mending and thoughtful reuse. The curtains had been turned and re-hemmed when the original edges wore thin. The chair cushions bore patches cut from matching fabric, colors chosen to complement rather than merely cover. The quilts folded on the beds visible through an open doorway told stories of long winter nights and patient fingers. Making beauty from scraps because new wasn't an option, but beautiful still mattered. Poor but proud, Daniel recognized. Clean but patched. The kind of home that spoke of people who'd rather go without than go begging, who understood that dignity was something you maintained regardless of the balance in your bank account. "Sit, please," Martha gestured to the chair at the head of the table. Daniel hesitated, his hand frozen halfway to the chair back. That position carried weight beyond simple courtesy. It was the father's chair, the place of authority and protection, the seat of someone who stood between and all his family and whatever darkness waited beyond these walls. He'd sat in such a chair once, in a house in Austin that no longer existed except in his nightmares. He'd carved the turkey on Thanksgiving, said grace over Sunday dinners, listened to Anna's prayers before tucking her into bed. He'd been the head of a household, the protector and provider, the man his wife could count on and his daughter could trust without question. Look how well that had turned out. But Martha was already moving toward the cast iron stove, and the girls were watching him with eyes that held too much hope for him to disappoint them with his cowardice. He sat. The weight of the empty chair beside him pressed against his consciousness like a physical presence. Ghosts filled that space, memories so vivid he could almost see them. Margaret's gentle presence, the way she'd lean against his shoulder during evening prayers, and how her hand would find his when their daughter's childish words moved her to tears of joy. Anna's eager chatter about her day, her small hands reaching for the biscuits before Grace was finished, her absolute confidence that her father could solve any problem and answer any question. He pushed the memories down hard, the way he'd learned to do over 4 years of practice. Like banking a fire, covering the coals with ash so they wouldn't flame, but never quite letting them die. The heat was still there, the potential for burning, but contained where it couldn't destroy him completely. "Girls, wash your hands," Martha instructed from the stove where she was tending what smelled like bacon, a luxury saved for special occasions. They moved to a washstand in the corner, their actions synchronized in the way of twins who'd shared every experience since birth. They helped each other reach the soap, took turns at the towel, their movements economical and practiced. When they returned to the table, they settled into their chairs with identical grace, backs straight and hands folded. The kind of practiced quiet that spoke of good training and loving discipline. But their eyes remained fixed on Daniel with unabashed curiosity, the way children do when they encounter something unexpected and potentially wonderful. "Do you have children, Mr. Stone?" Emma asked, her voice bright with the kind of interest that expected detailed answers and wonderful stories. "Emma," Kate said softly, a gentle warning in her sister's direction. "It's all right," Daniel said, though his throat felt tight enough to strangle the words. "I did once, a daughter and a wife. Fever took them both 4 years back," he added, the words coming out rougher than he'd intended. The cabin fell silent except for the fire's crackle and the gentle sizzle of bacon in the pan. Even Martha paused in her cooking, her shoulders tensing with sympathy she was too polite to voice. Kate reached across the table and patted his weathered hand with her small one, the gesture so natural and compassionate it nearly undid him completely. "I'm sorry your family went to heaven," she said softly, her voice carrying the kind of matter-of-fact acceptance that children brought to life's hardest truths. "Ours went too. Papa makes good company for them, I bet." Daniel's chest constricted so hard he couldn't breathe for a moment. Margaret would have loved these children, would have seen in them the daughters she'd always wanted to give Anna for sisters. She would have gathered them close and told them stories about angels and reunions and love that doesn't end just because breathing does. Martha served breakfast with the kind of quiet efficiency that spoke of long practice. Eggs from their own chickens, golden and perfectly cooked. Biscuits that were light and flaky despite being made with what was probably carefully hoarded white flour. Precious bacon, crispy and still sizzling. The kind of luxury that marked this as a special meal prepared for a special occasion. Simple food that tasted like effort and care, and the kind of love that showed itself through action rather than words. Daniel hadn't realized how much he'd missed the taste of food prepared with love rather than mere necessity. How different a meal could be when it was offered freely rather than purchased with cold coins. Martha took her own seat, her movements careful and graceful despite the obvious exhaustion that seemed to hang around her shoulders like a heavy shawl. She didn't pry into his loss, didn't offer empty condolences or awkward questions. Instead, she offered quiet respect and a warm meal and the kind of acceptance that asked for nothing in return. The girls ate with the enthusiasm of children who understood that special meals were rare and should be savored. But their excitement was contained, controlled by the good manners their mother had obviously worked hard to instill. When their plates were clean, they exchanged a glance that spoke of shared secrets and careful planning. They disappeared to their corner of the cabin, returning with 2 small carved wooden horses that they presented to Daniel with the pride of children showing their most treasured possessions. "Papa made these," Emma said, her voice glowing with love and loss intertwined, "before he went to heaven. See the manes, he carved every single hair." Daniel examined the horses with the careful attention they deserved, turning them over in his hands to appreciate the craftsmanship. The work was exceptional, far beyond simple whittling. Each horse had distinct personality carved into the wood, individual expressions and poses that spoke of an artist who understood his subject intimately. The wood had been polished smooth by countless small hands, worn soft by hours of play and imagination. He could see the love that had gone into both the making and the cherishing, the way these simple toys had become precious beyond their material value. "Your papa was skilled," he said, and both girls beamed with the kind of pride that children took in their parents' accomplishments. The workmanship reminded him of toys he'd carved for Anna, small animals and dolls that had burned with their house because he couldn't bear to save anything that would remind him of what he'd lost. Looking at these horses, he regretted that choice. Some things were too precious to burn, even when they carried pain. "Mr. Stone," Kate's quiet voice drew his attention, and he found her watching him with the kind of serious expression that looked strange on such a young face. "Will you stay for Christmas dinner too? Mama's making venison stew. It's our special meal." The question hung in the air between them, weighted with hope and possibility and the kind of dangerous thinking that had gotten him into trouble before. Staying for breakfast was one thing, a simple kindness that cost nothing but time. But dinner meant a whole day, meant involvement and connection and the risk of caring about people he'd have to leave behind. Martha started to refuse on his behalf, her instincts apparently as protective of his freedom as his own. "Girls, Mr. Stone surely has places to be. People are expecting him." But that was the problem. No one was expecting him anywhere. No one would miss him if he never arrived. No one would mourn his absence or celebrate his presence. He'd made sure of that, had carefully constructed a life where he mattered to no one and no one mattered to him. "Just dinner," he heard himself say, the words escaping before his mind could catch up and stop them. "Just today, if your mama doesn't mind." Martha's eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering across her face before being replaced by something that looked like gratitude mixed with concern. "We'd be honored," she said simply. A wise man knows when he's been outfoxed, Daniel thought, especially when the foxes are knee-high and wearing pigtails and have eyes that could melt snow with their warmth. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault on the world, fat flakes drifting past the window like white feathers, covering the landscape in pristine silence. Daniel watched them fall and realized what he'd agreed to. A whole day with a family that wasn't his, in a home that could crack open every sealed wound inside him. But as Kate showed him more of her drawings, careful sketches of animals and flowers made with precious paper and carefully sharpened pencils, and Emma demonstrated how the wooden horses could gallop across the table in elaborate races, something loosened in his chest, not healing, not yet. He wasn't fool enough to think that a single meal could undo 4 years of careful emotional numbness. But maybe recognition that healing might someday be possible again, that the part of him that had died with his family might not be as dead as he thought. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted his coffee cup, the tremor so small he hoped no one noticed. Just today, he told himself. He could survive just today, could let these people matter to him for just these few hours, and then tomorrow he'd ride on to Cheyenne in the badge that waited there and the familiar emptiness that kept him safe. But already watching Emma's animated gestures as she told a story about the wooden horses, seeing Kate's quiet smile as she arranged the toys in careful patterns, he suspected that today might be more dangerous than any outlaw he'd ever faced. After breakfast, as the girls settled by the fire with their carved horses and began an elaborate game that seemed to involve equal parts imagination and complex rules only they understood, Martha poured fresh coffee from the pot she kept warming on the stove. The rich aroma filled the cabin, mixing with the scent of pine logs and the faint sweetness of the biscuits that still sat cooling on the table. She settled across from Daniel, her movements careful and deliberate, like someone who'd learned that hasty actions could have consequences that lasted long after the moment passed. The morning light streaming through the single window caught the exhaustion in her face, illuminating the fine lines around her eyes and the tension she carried in her shoulders. This was a woman who'd been bearing too much weight for too long, Daniel realized. The kind of bone-deep weariness that came from being solely responsible for keeping a family alive in a homestead running in country that tested the strong and broke the weak without mercy. "I should explain about their father," she said quietly, her voice pitched low enough that the girls wouldn't overhear. "About James." Daniel waited, recognizing the careful way she chose her words. This was a woman who'd learned that truth could be dangerous, that the wrong words to the wrong person could bring consequences that echoed long after the conversation ended. "James was a good man," she began, her fingers wrapped around her coffee cup like it was an anchor in rough seas. "Strong, hardworking. He came out here in '85 when the territory opened new homestead claims under the Expanded Act. Had dreams of making something from nothing." Her voice steadied as she spoke of him, love mixing with loss in a way Daniel recognized too well. The way she said his name carried the weight of shared dreams and private jokes and 1,000 small moments that had made up a marriage. "He was trained as a surveyor back in Illinois," she continued. "Good with instruments, careful with measurements. understood the importance of precision when dealing with property boundaries. Out here, a mistake in marking could cost a family everything they'd worked for. Daniel nodded. He'd seen boundary disputes in his time as a ranger, knew how easily they could turn violent when a man's livelihood hung in the balance. The local mining company hired him regular, Martha said, her voice growing more cautious. Silver Crown Mining. They needed someone reliable to check their claim boundaries, make sure they weren't accidentally working someone else's land. Judge Caldwell owned a piece of the operation, and he liked having James survey the new claims before they filed the paperwork. Something in her tone made Daniel lean forward, coffee cup forgotten. The way she said Judge Caldwell carried a weight that spoke of more than simple business relationships. James died in what they called a mining accident, she continued, her voice dropping even lower. Cave-in at one of the Silver Crown shafts just outside town. The foreman said he was working alone in an area that hadn't been properly shored up. Said it was tragic but not uncommon in mining country. Daniel caught the careful phrasing, the way she said they called and the foreman said, like she was quoting someone else's story rather than stating facts she believed. But James wasn't working the mine that day, Martha said, meeting his eyes directly. He was surveying, checking the boundary markers against the original territorial filing, and what he found didn't match. The fire crackled behind them, and outside the wind picked up, rattling the windows with a sound like skeletal fingers tapping against the glass. The girls' quiet place seemed to exist in a different world, innocent and untouched by the darkness their mother was revealing. The night before the accident, Martha continued, her voice barely above a whisper, James came home upset. More than upset, angry in a way I'd never seen him. Said he'd found discrepancies in the survey, evidence that someone had been moving boundary markers to increase the size of certain claims. Daniel's blood began to simmer with the familiar heat of injustice. How much land are we talking about? Enough to matter. Some claims had been expanded by 20, 30 acres. Doesn't sound like much until you realize that those extra acres contain the richest mineral deposits. Someone was stealing land that belonged to small homesteaders and adding it to claims owned by the mining company. Your husband found proof? Martha nodded slowly. He had measurements, photographs of markers that had been moved, documentation that showed the original stakes versus where they had been repositioned. He was planning to take everything to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, file a formal complaint. But he never made it. He died that night, alone in a mine shaft that supposedly collapsed while he was checking something for the foreman. But James was careful, Mr. Stone. He'd been in mines before, knew how to recognize unstable ground. He wouldn't have gone into a dangerous area alone. Daniel leaned back in his chair, pieces of a familiar puzzle falling into place. A surveyor who discovered evidence of land fraud. A convenient accident. A judge with financial interests in the mining company and the power to make sure inconvenient questions weren't asked. You think he was murdered? It wasn't a question, and Martha didn't treat it like one. I think James found proof that Judge Caldwell and his partners were stealing land from homesteaders, she said with quiet certainty. I think he was killed to keep him quiet. And I think Caldwell has been working ever since to make sure no one asked the right questions. The girls' laughter drifted from the fireplace, where Emma was narrating an elaborate adventure involving the wooden horses and what appeared to be a quest to rescue a princess from a tower made of stacked firewood. The sound of innocence and joy stood in stark contrast to the conversation about murder and corruption unfolding at the table. After the funeral, Martha continued, Judge Caldwell came to see me, offered to buy the homestead, said it would be too much for a woman alone to handle. When I refused, he started finding problems. What kind of problems? Legal problems. Said James's original filing had irregularities, that the property boundaries weren't properly marked according to territorial standards, claimed the survey stakes were wrong and we might be squatting on land we didn't own. Daniel's jaw tightened. Did he offer to help resolve these problems? Oh yes, very generous of him. Said he could arrange for a new survey, have the boundaries properly established, all for a reasonable fee, or I could simply sell to him at a fair price and avoid the legal complications entirely. And if you refused? Martha's smile was bitter as winter wind. Then he started suggesting that a woman of questionable character might not be fit to raise children alone. began talking about the importance of stable home environments and proper moral guidance. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a damp fire, acrid and choking. Daniel had seen men like Caldwell before, men who used the law as a weapon against anyone who stood in their way. They hid behind respectability and community standing while destroying lives with legal technicalities and social pressure. The town took his side, Martha continued. Judge Caldwell's been here since territorial days, has connections in Cheyenne, owns pieces of half the businesses in town. I'm just a widow with 2 children and a homestead that might be sitting on something valuable. What kind of valuable? Martha glanced toward the girls, making sure they were still absorbed in their play, then met his eyes directly. Silver. James found traces of it in the creek that runs through our back 40. Nothing major, not enough to justify a mining operation on its own, but enough to make the claim worth more than simple farming land. Daniel felt the familiar cold anger settling in his stomach, the same feeling he'd carried as a Texas Ranger when he knew he was looking at injustice disguised as law. So Caldwell wants your land because he knows what's under it. I think Caldwell has been stealing mineral-rich land from homesteaders for years, using his position as a judge to make the theft legal. James found evidence that could prove it, so James had to die. And now Caldwell wants to finish what he started by taking our land and making sure no one else asks questions about survey irregularities. Martha's voice remained calm and steady, but Daniel could see the steel beneath her composed surface. This was a woman who'd thought through every angle, who'd spent long nights putting pieces together and reaching conclusions that no one would want to hear. Have you told anyone else about this? Martha's laugh held no humor whatsoever. Who would I tell? Judge Caldwell controls the territorial court in this district. The sheriff's his brother-in-law. The newspaper editor owes him money for a loan that helped keep the paper running during the last recession. I'm a woman alone with no proof except suspicions and a dead husband. What about the territorial authorities in Cheyenne? With what evidence? A man died in a mining accident. Tragic but not uncommon. A widow thinks her husband was murdered, but can't prove it. Grief makes people imagine conspiracies, they'd say. Besides, Judge Caldwell has friends in Cheyenne too, men who've profited from his cooperation over the years. Daniel studied her face, seeing the intelligence behind the exhaustion, the careful planning of someone who'd considered every option and found them all wanting. This was a woman who'd been backed into a corner by forces larger than herself, who'd watched justice fail and learned that sometimes the law protected the guilty more than the innocent. So you've been waiting, he said, waiting and surviving, keeping my girls safe and my property protected and hoping that someday someone might ask the right questions or look in the right places. She paused, then shook her head. But hope is dangerous, Mr. Stone. It makes you vulnerable, makes you believe in things that might not exist. But she was hoping, Daniel realized. Despite everything she'd said about the dangers of hope, she was hoping. The way she'd offered him breakfast, the way she'd allowed her daughters to dream of having a father again, the way she looked at him like he might be the answer to prayers she'd been afraid to voice. Outside, the snow continued to fall in thick curtains that turned the world into something from a fairy tale. But fairy tales, Daniel knew, often had monsters hiding in their pages. And this particular story was beginning to sound like one where the monster wore a judge's robes and hid behind a badge of respectability. Ma'am, he said carefully, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate precision, would you mind if I took a look around your property this afternoon, just to see what you're working with? Hope flickered in Martha's steel blue eyes like a candle flame in a draft, bright and fragile and quickly hidden behind caution. Mr. Stone, I appreciate the offer, but I can't ask you to get involved in our troubles. Judge Caldwell is a dangerous man, and he doesn't forgive people who cross him. If he thought you were helping me, Daniel stood and moved to the window where he could see the fence line he'd ridden along that morning. Good strong posts, properly spaced, marking boundaries that someone had taken time to establish correctly. The kind of work that took pride in planning and the expectation of permanence. Ma'am, he said without turning around, I've been running from trouble for 4 years now. Maybe it's time I stopped running and started looking for it instead. When he turned back, Martha was watching him with an expression that reminded him painfully of Margaret, the same look his wife used to give him when she knew he'd made up his mind about something and wouldn't be talked out of it, no matter how dangerous or foolish it might be. Just today, Daniel added, echoing the promise he'd made about breakfast and dinner. Let me see what we're dealing with, and then I'll decide whether tomorrow needs to be different from what I planned. Martha nodded slowly, understanding passing between them like a current of electricity. Just today. But they both knew that some decisions couldn't be contained to single days, and some things, once started, developed momentum all their own. Outside, the wind howled like a warning, and somewhere in town, Judge Caldwell was probably making plans of his own. The storm would end eventually, and when it did, choices would have to be made that couldn't be unmade. Daniel looked at Emma and Kate, still playing by the fire, still believing that Christmas wishes could come true and that strangers on horseback might be the answer to their prayers. He felt something shift inside him, not hope exactly, but recognition that hope might someday be possible again. The wooden horses galloped across the hearthstones, carrying dreams of family and safety and homes that couldn't be stolen by men who wore corruption like a badge of honor. Just today, Daniel thought, but already he was beginning to suspect that today might stretch longer than he'd planned, and that the empty badge waiting for him in Cheyenne might not be as important as the justice that needed delivering right here. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin, something warmer than fire was beginning to kindle, something that felt dangerously like belonging, like the kind of connection he'd sworn never to risk again. He'd ridden 1,000 miles to escape his past, but maybe, just maybe, he'd finally found something worth stopping for. Daniel couldn't sit still. By mid-morning, restlessness drove him outside despite the falling snow and bitter wind that cut through his coat like a blade. His hands needed work. His mind needed occupation. Idleness left too much room for thinking, and thinking led to remembering. And remembering led to the kind of pain that could paralyze a man if he let it take hold. The homestead offered plenty of distractions for someone who understood that survival in this country depended on constant maintenance and preparation. Daniel had learned long ago that a ranch was like a living thing that required daily attention, or it would sicken and die under the weight of neglect and harsh weather. The wood pile was dangerously low for winter, barely enough to last another week if the cold snap continued. Someone had been rationing fuel, burning only what was absolutely necessary to keep the cabin warm. It was the kind of careful conservation that spoke of a woman alone, making hard choices about comfort versus survival. Daniel found a broad axe in the small barn, its head nicked but still sharp, the handle worn smooth by years of use. James Brennan had taken care of his tools, Daniel noted with approval. A man could tell a lot about another man by the condition of his equipment, and these tools spoke of someone who understood that good maintenance was the difference between success and failure on the frontier. The rhythm of splitting wood soothed something deep in Daniel's chest that had been tight for too long. Lift, swing, crack. Each split log was a thought silenced, each stroke of the axe a moment when the past couldn't intrude. The work was honest and necessary, the kind of labor that built something useful instead of simply destroying. He'd only been working 10 minutes when Emma appeared at the barn door, wrapped in a coat that was too big for her small frame. She stood at a safe distance, watching with bright eyes that missed nothing. "What are you doing, Mr. Stone?" she asked, her breath forming tiny clouds in the cold air. "Building up your wood pile," Daniel replied, setting another log on the chopping block. "Winter's got a lot of fight left in it. Can I help?" Daniel paused, the axe halfway through its swing. In his previous life, he would have said no automatically, would have explained that splitting wood was dangerous work for a grown man, not a game for children. But something in Emma's eager face stopped the refusal before it could form. "You can stack what I split," he said, careful of the sharp edges. Emma set to work with the kind of enthusiasm that only children possessed, small arms struggling with logs that weighed nearly as much as she did. Her movements were inefficient but determined, and Daniel found himself adjusting his pace to match hers, giving her time to clear each piece before he split the next. Kate emerged from the cabin after a few minutes, watching from the porch with the quiet intensity that seemed to be her trademark. She didn't join the work, but her eyes tracked every movement Daniel made, as if she was memorizing the way he handled the axe, the way he positioned each log for the most efficient split. Martha appeared with a water bucket, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders against the wind. She watched him work for a moment, taking in the growing pile of split wood and her daughter's determined efforts to help. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice carrying gratitude mixed with something that might have been embarrassment. "Can't sit idle," Daniel replied, setting up another log. "Besides, you need the wood." He swung the axe again, and the log split cleanly down the middle. Emma cheered as if he'd performed some kind of magic trick, and Daniel felt an unfamiliar warmth that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Martha studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I'll help with the fence then. Been meaning to fix those loose rails before spring." She disappeared into the barn and returned with a toolbox that showed the same careful maintenance as the axe, James Brennan's tools, preserved and kept ready by a woman who understood their value. She selected a hammer and a pouch of nails, then walked to the section of fence where Daniel had noticed sagging rails that morning. They worked in companionable silence, two adults fixing what needed fixing without the need for constant conversation or elaborate explanations. Daniel respected that kind of practical cooperation. Martha wasn't performing gratitude or helplessness. She was simply working alongside him, contributing what she could to the maintenance of her own property. The work felt good in a way Daniel had almost forgotten. Not just the physical satisfaction of muscles used properly, but the deeper contentment that came from building something, from making a place better than you'd found it. For 4 years, his work had been about endings rather than beginnings, about moving on rather than staying put. By early afternoon, he'd restocked the woodpile with enough fuel to last through January, repaired 3 fence posts that had been working loose in their holes, and adjusted the barn door until it hung true and sealed properly against winter drafts. His muscles ached pleasantly, and his mind had quieted in a way it hadn't since he'd ridden away from Texas. The girls had been constant companions throughout the work, Emma chattering and helping wherever she could, Kate observing everything with the intensity of someone storing up memories for future reference. They asked questions about everything he did, wanted to know why he positioned the axe just so, why he chose certain pieces of wood over others, why the fence post needed to be set at exactly that depth. Daniel found himself explaining things he'd learned over years of ranch work, sharing knowledge that had been gathering dust in his mind since Margaret's death. It felt strange to be teaching again, to have someone value what he knew about practical things like wood grain and post-hole digging and the proper way to hang a door. Mr. Stone, Emma called, running toward him with Kate following more slowly. "We made you something." They thrust a piece of paper at him, and Daniel looked down at a drawing done in charcoal and colored pencils. 3 stick figures stood in front of a cabin, surrounded by what looked like a fence and several horses. The proportions were childish, but the care was evident in every line. Below the drawing, in careful child's writing, someone had printed "Our Family." The word "our" had been erased and rewritten, as if the artist had debated whether it was presumptuous to include him. "Do you like it?" Emma bounced on her toes with nervous energy. "Kate drew it. She's the good artist. I did the letters." Kate watched him with quiet intensity, her dark eyes serious in a way that seemed far older than her years. "You can keep it if you want," she said softly. "Mama says it's polite to give guests something to remember their visit." Daniel stared at the drawing, his throat closing completely. In the center stood a tall figure that was obviously meant to be him, flanked by a woman in a dress and 2 small girls. The stick figures held hands in a chain of connection that spoke of belonging and permanence. He should give it back, should explain that he wasn't part of their family, wasn't anybody's family, couldn't be what they needed. But his fingers curled around the paper's edges protectively, and the words wouldn't come. "It's real fine," he managed, his voice rough with emotion he didn't trust himself to examine too closely. "Best gift I've had in years." Both girls glowed like they'd swallowed sunshine, their faces bright with pride and pleasure. Martha called from the porch where she'd been watching the exchange. "Dinner will be ready soon. Girls, come wash up." As they ran toward the cabin, Emma called over her shoulder, "Daddy always said every tool has a purpose. You're our Christmas tool, Mr. Stone." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Our Christmas tool. Not a man, not a potential father or husband, but an instrument sent to serve a purpose they'd defined without asking his permission. The innocence of it made it somehow more devastating than any manipulation could have been. Martha touched his arm gently as she passed. "Thank you for everything," she said simply. "The girls haven't been this happy since before James died." Daniel stood in the falling snow, clutching a child's drawing, his chest aching with an emotion he'd thought he'd buried forever. The barn door he'd fixed hung straight and solid. The woodpile would keep them warm through the worst of winter. The fence would hold against whatever storms came. But none of that mattered if he couldn't protect them from the real danger that was coming. Judge Caldwell wouldn't be deterred by repaired fences and stacked firewood. Men like him understood only power and fear, and Daniel was beginning to realize that this family had very little of either. Idle hands make a man think too much, he reminded himself. Best keep them busy before the heart starts talking. But his heart was already talking, and he was terrified of what it might say. The drawing crinkled slightly in his grip, and he carefully smoothed it flat. 3 stick figures, holding hands, representing something he'd lost once and sworn never to risk again. But sometimes the most dangerous thing wasn't riding into a gunfight or facing down an outlaw. Sometimes the most dangerous thing was allowing yourself to hope. Christmas dinner is sacred in a way that had nothing to do with religious ceremony and everything to do with the kind of grace that showed itself through careful preparation and generous hearts. Martha had used their best dishes, mismatched pieces that told stories of wedding gifts and careful shopping, and plates saved from whatever disaster had brought them to this remote homestead. The table wore a cloth that had been mended so carefully the repairs became part of its character. Candles flickered in holders made from polished tin cans, their light soft and golden against the growing darkness outside. The venison stew steamed in a pot that had seen better days, but had been scrubbed until it shone, its contents rich with vegetables that had been carefully preserved from the autumn harvest. The twins insisted Daniel sit at the head of the table again, and this time he didn't hesitate. The weight of the position felt less foreign now, more like something he might grow into rather than something that would crush him under its responsibilities. That's where Daddy always sat, Emma explained matter-of-factly, as if his presence there was the most natural thing in the world. Martha served the stew with quiet dignity, ladling it into bowls with the kind of care that turns simple food into something approaching communion. Biscuits, golden and fluffy, sat alongside dried apple pie that filled the cabin with the scent of cinnamon and home. The meal passed with gentle conversation that felt comfortable rather than forced. The girls chattered about their wooden horses, their favorite games, the stories their papa used to tell them before bed. Daniel listened more than he talked, but his silence felt peaceful rather than cold. After the pie, sweet and tart and perfect despite being made with carefully hoarded ingredients, the twins grew drowsy from food and warmth, and the emotional exhaustion that came from hoping so hard for something that seemed almost within reach. They curled by the fire with their wooden horses clutched in small hands, and within minutes their breathing deepened into the profound sleep of children who felt safe and loved. Martha covered them with a quilt that showed the same careful mending as everything else in the cabin, then settled into the chair opposite Daniel. The firelight painted her features in warm bronze, highlighting the strength in her face and softening the lines of exhaustion around her eyes. For the first time since he'd met her, she looked almost peaceful, as if the simple act of sharing a meal with another adult had lifted some burden from her shoulders. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, listening to the fire crackle and the wind whistle around the cabin's corners. Outside, the storm had intensified, and Daniel found himself grateful for the warmth and shelter, for the simple human pleasure of not facing the night alone. "I should explain more about Judge Caldwell," Martha said finally, her voice low enough not to disturb the sleeping children, "about what we're really dealing with." Daniel waited, sensing that she was choosing her words carefully, that what she was about to tell him carried dangers beyond simple knowledge. "Harrison Caldwell came to Wyoming Territory in '78, she began, staring into the fire as if the flames held memories she could see more clearly than the present. He was young then, ambitious, and he understood something that most people missed about territorial government. She paused to sip her coffee, gathering her thoughts like someone assembling pieces of a puzzle she'd been working on for years. The territorial system was designed to be temporary, a stepping stone towards statehood. But temporary government means temporary oversight, temporary records, temporary accountability. A smart man could accomplish a lot in that kind of environment if he wasn't too particular about methods. Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind outside. He'd seen territorial corruption before, knew how easily men could disappear into legal gray areas where federal oversight was thin, and local law was whatever the strongest man decided it should be. Caldwell got himself appointed as a territorial judge through connections back east, Martha continued. Then he started buying into local businesses, the bank, the mining companies, the land development ventures. Nothing obvious, nothing that would draw attention from territorial authorities. Just quiet partnerships that gave him influence without responsibility. And when people had legal problems, they found that Judge Caldwell was remarkably helpful in resolving disputes, especially when the resolution happened to benefit his business interests. Survey disputes that awarded extra acreage to mining companies he owned pieces of. Inheritance cases that somehow left valuable property in the hands of men who owed him favors. Boundary disagreements that always seemed to favor whoever was willing to pay the right fees. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney, and Martha's voice grew quieter, more careful. James wasn't the first person to notice irregularities in land surveys, but he was the first to document them systematically, to gather evidence that could prove a pattern of fraud. And he was honest enough to believe that presenting that evidence to the right authorities would result in justice. Daniel's jaw tightened with familiar anger. How naive was he? Naive enough to believe that law meant something more than whoever had the most power to enforce it. Naive enough to think that truth mattered more than money. Naive enough to trust that Judge Caldwell would want to investigate evidence of survey fraud rather than cover it up. Martha set down her coffee cup and looked directly at Daniel, her steel blue eyes reflecting the firelight. James went to see Judge Caldwell 3 days before he died, told him about the discrepancies he'd found, said he had evidence that someone was systematically stealing land from homesteaders, asked for advice about how to proceed through proper legal channels. Daniel's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. Wait, James Brennan from Illinois, surveyor who worked in Cedar Falls before coming west? Martha looked startled. Yes, that's right. How did you? Because I knew him. Daniel set down his cup with shaking hands. I was the sheriff in Cedar Falls when James lived there. Good man, honest worker. And Martha, his voice grew rough with guilt. He wrote to me 6 months ago, a letter asking for help with land disputes out here. Said he needed advice from someone in law enforcement he could trust. The cabin fell silent except for the fire's crackle. I never answered that letter, Daniel continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I was so buried in grief, so determined not to care about anyone else's problems, that I let it sit on my desk until I threw it away. Martha's hand went to her throat. You could have helped him? I could have warned him about men like Caldwell, could have told him how these land fraud schemes work, how to gather evidence safely, how to contact federal authorities. Daniel's jaw tightened. Your husband died because I was too selfish with my grief to help a good man who trusted me. And Caldwell promised to look into it. Caldwell was very interested, wanted to see all of James's evidence, all his documentation, said he'd need to examine everything carefully before deciding how to proceed. James was so pleased to have the judge's cooperation that he turned over his entire file. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, seeing the trap close around a good man who'd believed in justice. And then James had an accident. And then James had an accident, Martha confirmed. Very convenient timing. And when I went to Judge Caldwell after the funeral, asking about James's survey work, he seemed genuinely puzzled. Said he had no knowledge of any evidence James might have gathered. He couldn't imagine what I was talking about. The cynicism of it was breathtaking in its simplicity. Eliminate the witness. Destroy the evidence. Express sympathy for the grieving widow. Clean, efficient, and completely legal. So now Caldwell knows that James found proof of the land fraud, but he also knows the proof is gone, Daniel said. Except for one problem. James was careful about his work, methodical. Judge Caldwell can't be certain that James didn't make copies of his documentation, or that there isn't evidence hidden somewhere that could still cause trouble. Martha leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Which means he needs to control James's property. Needs to make sure that anything James might have hidden is safely in his hands. And he needs to control me, make sure I can't ask inconvenient questions or pursue investigations that might resurrect James's work. So he uses legal pressure to force you off the land, and social pressure to isolate me from potential allies. A woman alone with questionable morals, allowing strange men to spend the night, clearly unfit to raise children properly. The kind of woman who might imagine conspiracies or make wild accusations against respected community leaders. Daniel felt the familiar cold anger settling in his stomach, the same feeling he'd carried as a Texas Ranger when he knew he was looking at injustice disguised as law. Judge Caldwell was playing a long game, using time and social pressure to achieve what violence might accomplish more quickly, but less safely. "The bastard's careful," Daniel said grimly. "Lets other people do his dirty work while he keeps his hands clean. Careful and patient and absolutely ruthless when necessary." James wasn't the first man to die conveniently when he became inconvenient to Judge Caldwell's interests. Outside, the wind howled like something alive and angry, rattling the windows and sending occasional puffs of snow down the chimney to sizzle in the fire. The storm seemed to be intensifying, which meant they might be snowed in for days. Under normal circumstances, that would be a minor inconvenience, but nothing about their circumstances was normal. "Martha," Daniel said carefully, "is there any chance Caldwell knows I'm here?" "In this storm? I don't see how. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles away, and nobody travels in weather like this unless they absolutely have to." But even as she said it, Daniel could see doubt creeping into her expression. Judge Caldwell hadn't survived this long by leaving things to chance, and the appearance of a stranger at exactly the wrong time would be the kind of coincidence that would demand investigation. "Tomorrow," Daniel said, "when this storm breaks, he's going to come calling." Martha nodded slowly. "He'll want to know who you are, why you're here, how much you've learned, and he'll want to make sure you understand what happens to people who interfere with his business." The sleeping children stirred slightly by the fire, and both adults automatically lowered their voices further. Emma mumbled something in her sleep about horses and Christmas presents, her small face peaceful in a way that made Daniel's chest tight with protective instincts he'd thought were buried forever. "I won't let him hurt them," Daniel said, the words coming out harder and more definite than he'd intended. Martha studied his face in the firelight, seeing something there that made her expression shift from hope to concern. "Mr. Stone, Daniel, I appreciate what you're offering, but Judge Caldwell has been destroying people for over a decade. He has the law on his side. He has money. He has connections that reach all the way to the territorial capital. You're one man with a gun and a conscience. Sometimes that's enough, and sometimes it just gets good men killed while bad men go on destroying lives." Daniel looked at the drawing the girls had given him, now carefully folded and tucked into his shirt pocket. 3 stick figures holding hands, representing something that might be possible if he was brave enough and smart enough and lucky enough to keep it safe. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but some things are worth the risk." Martha's smile was sad and grateful and terrified all at once. James used to say things like that, right up until Judge Caldwell had him killed. Outside, the storm raged on, and somewhere in town, Judge Caldwell was probably sleeping peacefully in a warm bed, confident that his problems would resolve themselves through patience and pressure and the natural order of things that favored men with power over men with principles. But Daniel Stone had spent 4 years running from the kind of connection that made a man vulnerable to loss. And he was discovering that some things were worth being vulnerable for. Some things were worth standing and fighting for, even when the odds were long and the enemy held all the advantages. The fire burned lower, casting longer shadows across the cabin walls, and Daniel made his decision. Tomorrow, when the storm broke, Judge Caldwell would indeed come calling. And when he did, he'd find that some strangers were more dangerous than others, and that some Christmas wishes came with teeth. Morning brought trouble wearing a smile. Daniel woke in the barn where he'd insisted on sleeping, proper boundaries being important even in extraordinary circumstances. The cold had seeped into his bones overnight, and his breath steamed in the frigid air as he fed his Mustang and checked the animal's hooves for ice. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the world transformed under 2 feet of pristine snow that glittered like scattered diamonds under a brilliant blue sky. It was the kind of morning that made a man believe in the possibility of fresh starts and clean slates, if he was fool enough to trust in such things. Daniel had learned the hard way that beautiful mornings often preceded ugly days. He was forking hay to his horse when the twins burst into the barn, their excitement so bright it seemed to generate its own warmth. "Mr. Stone, come see the snow," Emma called, grabbing his free hand with both of hers. "It's so sparkly it hurts your eyes." Kate followed more quietly, but her smile was radiant. "Everything looks different," she said with the wonder that children brought to transformation, like the whole world got covered with sugar. Before Daniel could respond, the sound of hoofbeats broke the morning silence. Not the careful pace of someone traveling difficult ground, but the confident cadence of a rider who expected the world to accommodate him rather than the other way around. Daniel stepped outside, the girls flanking him like small bodyguards. A single rider approached through the snow, his mount a well-fed bay gelding that spoke of money and good care. The man in the saddle sat with the easy confidence of authority, his expensive coat and beaver hat marking him as someone who'd never missed a meal or worried about staying warm. Martha emerged from the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron, her face going carefully neutral when she recognized their visitor. Daniel watched her armor slam into place, the walls going up behind her eyes as she prepared to defend ground she couldn't afford to lose. "Judge Caldwell," she said, her voice polite but cold. "Good morning." Harrison Caldwell dismounted with practiced ease, his movements economical and sure. He was a man in his early 50s, well-dressed and well-fed, with the kind of confidence that came from years of having his will respected without question. His smile was pleasant and never reached his eyes, which cataloged everything they saw with the cold assessment of a man who missed very little. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy, "just checking on you folks after that storm, making sure the widow and her girls survived the night safely." His eyes swept over Daniel, taking in the worn gun belt and the way he stood between the children and their visitor. The assessment was quick and professional, like one predator sizing up another. "And who might this be?" Caldwell asked, his smile sharpening slightly. "A traveler," Martha said quickly, stepping forward to draw attention away from Daniel. "He took shelter from the storm." "I see." Caldwell's attention returned to Daniel with increased interest. "Shelter, of course. Christian charity and all that." He stepped closer to Martha, lowering his voice to a tone of false concern. "Mrs. Brennan, I'd hate to see talk start again. You know how the town worries about the girls' welfare. Strange men staying overnight with a woman alone? Well, people draw conclusions." The threat was delivered with a smile that made Daniel's trigger finger itch. Caldwell wasn't just questioning Martha's judgment. He was attacking her fitness as a mother, using her children as weapons against her. "Mr. Stone is a gentleman," Martha said carefully, each word chosen for maximum safety. "He slept in the barn." Of course. Of course." Caldwell waved a dismissive hand. "I'm sure he's perfectly respectable. But you understand my concern. Those girls need stability, proper guidance. I'd hate for anyone to question your fitness as their mother." The poisonous implications hung in the air like smoke from a green fire. Daniel's fists clenched at his sides, every instinct screaming at him to wipe that false concern off Caldwell's face with his knuckles. But opening his mouth would only make things worse for Martha, would give Caldwell more ammunition to use against her. Emma moved closer to Daniel, her small hand finding his with instinctive trust. The gesture wasn't lost on Judge Caldwell, whose eyes narrowed slightly at this evidence of connection, of inappropriate attachment between a stranger and children who should know better. "I'm sure you understand," Caldwell continued, his voice soft with mock sympathy, "how important appearances are in a small community, how quickly rumors can spread, how difficult they are to stop once they start, especially when they concern the welfare of innocent children." Kate stepped to Daniel's other side, her quiet solidarity as damning as her sister's more obvious display of affection. Judge Caldwell's smile grew colder as he registered this additional evidence of improper influence. "Of course," he said, mounting his horse with fluid grace, "I'm certain this is just a misunderstanding." "Mr. Stone," Daniel said, his voice carefully neutral, despite the rage building in his chest. "Daniel Stone." "Mr. Stone, I'm sure you'll be moving on soon. A man of your obvious experience surely has important business elsewhere." The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning. This was a warning delivered with a smile, a suggestion that staying would bring consequences that extended far beyond social disapproval. Caldwell touched his hat brim in a gesture of mock courtesy. "Good day, Mrs. Brennan. Give my regards to the girls. Such beautiful children deserve the very best care, don't you think?" He rode away with the same confident pace he'd arrived with, leaving behind the kind of silence that followed explosions. Martha stood frozen, humiliation and fury warring on her face, while the twins looked between the adults with confusion that would soon turn to understanding and fear. "I should go," Daniel said quietly, his voice rough with controlled anger. Martha turned to him, resignation replacing the fury in her eyes. "Yes," she said simply. "You should, before more people see you here, before more talk starts. I can't afford any more attention from Judge Caldwell." Her voice was steady, but Daniel heard the cracks beneath the surface, the sound of someone who'd been pushed as far as they could go and still remained standing. The judge had played his hand with surgical precision, using Martha's love for her children against her, making Daniel's presence a liability she couldn't afford. Some snakes don't rattle before they strike, Daniel thought grimly. They smile and tip their hats and deliver poison with perfect manners. Emma tugged at his coat, her face screwed up with a kind of confusion that preceded tears. "You're not really leaving, are you? You promised to stay for Christmas." "I never promised that, honey." "You said just today, but that was yesterday. Today is still part of Christmas, isn't it?" The innocent logic hit him like a physical blow. In a child's mind, the holiday season was an unbroken stretch of magic and possibility, not a single day that could be used up and discarded. They'd asked for a Christmas daddy, and he'd given them barely 24 hours before abandoning them to face whatever came next alone. Kate said nothing, but her dark eyes held the kind of understanding that was far too mature for her age. She knew he was leaving, knew that grown-ups always left when things got difficult, knew that hoping for anything different was just another way of setting yourself up for disappointment. "I'm sorry," Daniel said, the words inadequate for everything they were supposed to carry. "I'm truly sorry." Martha gathered her daughters, her movements sharp with barely controlled emotion. "Girls, say goodbye to Mr. Stone. Thank him for his help with the wood and the fence." "Thank you," Emma said dutifully, her voice small with confusion and approaching tears. Kate just stared at him with eyes that accused him of being exactly what every other adult in her life had been, someone who left when staying got hard. Daniel mounted his Mustang, his movements mechanical, his mind already focusing on the road ahead and the empty badge waiting in Cheyenne. This was why he'd spent 4 years avoiding connections, why he'd learned to keep moving rather than risk caring about people he'd eventually have to leave behind. But as he rode away from the homestead, the twins' faces stayed with him. 50 yards down the road, he stopped. Behind him, the cabin grew smaller, but not less vivid. Smoke still rose from the chimney he'd helped stock with wood. The fence he'd mended stood straight and strong against the snow. And on the porch, 2 small figures stood watching him leave, their silence more devastating than any amount of crying could have been. Emma's voice carried across the snow, thin and breaking with the kind of loss that would mark her for years to come. "Daddy always said promises meant something, even when they were hard to keep." The words hit Daniel like a bullet to the chest. He hadn't made any promises, had been careful to avoid anything that could be construed as commitment. But to a 7-year-old girl who'd already lost one father, actions spoke louder than words. Eating at their table, fixing their fence, accepting they were drawing, those had been promises in a language louder than words. Martha stepped onto the porch, gathering her daughters with the kind of protective gesture that mothers made when the world proved once again that it was harder and colder than children deserved. She didn't call after him, didn't beg or plead. She'd been abandoned enough times to expect nothing different. "We'll manage," he heard her say to the girls, her voice carrying across the snow with heartbreaking dignity. "We always do." Daniel sat his horse in the middle of the snow-covered road, his hands gripping the reins so tight his knuckles had gone white. Behind him stood everything he'd learned to fear: connection, responsibility, the possibility of caring about something enough to be destroyed by losing it. Ahead lay the safe emptiness he'd cultivated for 4 years, the emotional numbness that protected him from pain by protecting him from everything else as well. A man can ride 1,000 miles to escape his heart, he thought, but it rides right alongside him the whole way. 4 years of running, 4 years of nameless towns and faceless strangers, of jobs that meant nothing and relationships that never developed past professional courtesy. 4 years of telling himself that isolation was safety, that not caring was the only way to avoid being hurt again. But those girls on that porch, crying for a man they'd known barely a day. That woman, strong enough to stand alone, but deserving someone to stand beside her. They weren't asking him to replace what he'd lost. They were offering him something new. His wife's face swam before his eyes, Margaret's gentle smile, her voice telling him that love wasn't something you used up or lost forever. It was something you found again, in new places, with new people, if you were brave enough to keep your heart open despite the pain. And maybe that was what surviving really meant. Not just breathing, not just existing from one empty day to the next, but living again. Taking the risk that caring involved, accepting that loss was possible, but that some things were worth the possibility of losing them. Daniel looked back at the cabin where two small faces pressed against the window, watching and hoping, despite every lesson life had taught them about the reliability of adults. Judge Caldwell wanted to shame Martha, wanted to isolate her and break her spirit and steal everything she had left. Let him try. Let the whole town try. Those girls deserved someone who wouldn't ride away when words got hard. That woman deserved someone who'd stand firm when storms came, whether they were made of snow or social pressure or corrupt judges who thought their power made them untouchable. He'd spent 4 years being nobody to no one, and what had it gotten him? Empty days and empty nights and the kind of safety that felt exactly like death. Maybe it was time to be somebody to someone again. Daniel turned his Mustang around. The animal moved eagerly, as if it too had been waiting for this decision, as if even horses understood that some choices were about more than simple direction. As he rode back toward the homestead, he saw Emma's face transform from despair to disbelief to radiant joy that could have powered the cabin's lights for a month. She grabbed Kate's arm, pointing and jumping up and down with excitement that was infectious even at a distance. Martha stepped off the porch, shading her eyes against the snow glare, her expression shifting through the same progression of emotions as her daughter's. Daniel rode up to the gate he'd ridden away from, stopping his horse with deliberate precision at the exact spot where this had all begun. Two small girls at a fence line, asking a stranger to be something he didn't think he could be anymore. "Thought you were leaving," Martha said carefully, hope and caution warring in her voice. "Changed my mind." He dismounted, his movement steady and sure. "You said the girls deserved to go to church. I think it's time this community remembered what Christian charity actually looks like." Martha's eyes widened. "Daniel, Judge Caldwell can go to hell," Daniel said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet certainty that made arguments pointless. "Your girls deserve to worship with their community, and anyone who says otherwise can say it to my face." Emma launched herself at his legs with the kind of enthusiasm that could knock a grown man over if he wasn't prepared for it. Kate followed more cautiously, but her smile outshone the sun on snow, bright and warm, and worth more than all the badges in all the territorial capitals in the West. "You came back," Kate whispered, her voice full of wonder. "You actually came back." "I did." Daniel knelt in the snow, bringing himself to their eye level, his voice gentle but firm. "And I'm not going anywhere again. Your mama needs help, and I reckon I could use a purpose." Martha watched him with an expression that mixed gratitude with the kind of caution that came from having hope disappointed too many times. "Daniel, you don't understand what you're volunteering for. Judge Caldwell is dangerous, and he doesn't forgive people who cross him." Daniel stood, brushing snow from his knees, his jaw set with the kind of determination that had once made him a good Texas Ranger. "Trouble finds everyone eventually, ma'am. Question is whether you face it alone or with someone standing beside you." He offered his hand. After a long moment, Martha took it, her fingers cold but her grip strong and sure. "Then let's give them something to talk about," she said quietly. Daniel almost smiled, almost being the key word, because smiling was still something he was remembering how to do. The church bells would ring soon, calling the faithful to worship. And when they did, Judge Caldwell would find that some strangers were harder to intimidate than others, and that some Christmas wishes came with consequences he hadn't anticipated. The wooden horses were still somewhere inside the cabin, still carrying dreams of family and safety and homes that couldn't be stolen by men who mistook power for righteousness. Some battles were worth fighting, even when the odds were long and the enemy held all the advantages. Some things were worth protecting, even when protection meant making yourself a target. Daniel Stone had spent 4 years running from the kind of love that could break a man's heart, but he was beginning to understand that the same love could also give a man something worth living for, worth fighting for, worth dying for if necessary. The fence gate stood open between them, no longer a barrier but an invitation, no longer keeping someone out but welcoming someone home. Time to see if Judge Caldwell was ready for the fight he'd been asking for. December 26th dawned clear and cold, the blizzard having blown itself out during the night. Daniel woke in the barn with something he hadn't felt in 4 years, purpose that extended beyond his own survival. He fed his horse and checked the repairs he'd made to the homestead, each task reinforcing his decision to stay and fight. When Emma and Kate burst through the barn doors with their usual morning energy, chattering about the fresh snow and their plans for the day, Daniel felt the last of his hesitation disappear. This was worth defending. These people were worth protecting. And Judge Caldwell was about to discover that some strangers carried more than just guns and good intentions. The real battle was about to begin. On December 28, 1889, 3 days after the Christmas morning, when Daniel Stone had first arrived at the Brennan homestead, Judge Harrison Caldwell made his move with the ruthless efficiency that had made him wealthy and the careful legal maneuvering that had kept him in power for over a decade. It came not as dramatic confrontation, but as a coordinated assault through multiple channels, each designed to overwhelm his opponents before they could mount an effective defense. Daniel was splitting wood in the morning cold when he saw Sheriff Tom Brennan's horse approaching through the snow, the rider's posture telegraphing reluctance and professional duty in equal measure. Behind him rode 2 other men Daniel didn't recognize, their expensive clothes and confident bearing marking them as outsiders with official business. "Sheriff," Daniel called out, setting down his axe and moving to intercept the visitors before they could reach the cabin. Whatever this was, it would be better handled away from Martha and the girls. "Mr. Stone," Brennan dismounted with obvious discomfort, his weathered face showing the strain of a man caught between family loyalty and professional obligation. "I've got papers to serve, legal documents requiring Mrs. Martha Brennan to appear before Judge Caldwell's court." The 2 strangers remained mounted, their attention focused on cataloging every detail of the homestead with the systematic thoroughness of men conducting official business. Daniel recognized the type: territorial bureaucrats armed with legal authority and protected by federal jurisdiction. Daniel accepted the folded papers, noting the official seals and formal language that transformed human suffering into legal procedure. The documents were comprehensive and devastating, attacking every aspect of Martha's life simultaneously to prevent effective defense. Foreclosure proceedings based on alleged unpaid debts to Silver Crown Mining Company. Eviction notices claiming the homestead was being used for immoral purposes that violated territorial settlement requirements. Custody proceedings questioning Martha's fitness as a mother based on inappropriate cohabitation with transient individuals of questionable character. The legal assault was masterful in its scope and timing, designed to force Martha into an impossible choice between fighting individual charges or mounting a comprehensive defense that would require resources she didn't possess. "When?" Daniel asked, keeping his voice level despite the fury building in his chest. "Day after tomorrow. 10 in the morning. Judge Caldwell's court." Sheriff Brennan's voice carried the flat tone of someone reciting information he didn't want to deliver. "Mr. Stone, if you're smart, you'll be long gone before then. This isn't your fight, and nothing good will come of getting mixed up in territorial politics you don't understand." One of the mounted men urged his horse closer, his expression showing the kind of cold professionalism that marked federal law enforcement. He was a man in his 40s with pale eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Mr. Stone, I'm Deputy United States Marshal William Hayes. I'm here to inform you that Judge Caldwell has requested federal assistance in maintaining order during these proceedings. Any interference with territorial court business will result in federal charges." Daniel studied the marshal's face, seeing competence and dedication, but also the limitations of a man who understood law, but not always justice. Hayes was exactly the kind of federal officer who could be manipulated by someone with Caldwell's skill at presenting criminal activity as legitimate legal procedure. Marshal Hayes, I appreciate the warning. Can I ask what specific information Judge Caldwell provided about these proceedings? Land dispute involving survey irregularities and property boundaries. Custody matter involving children at risk due to inappropriate living arrangements. Standard territorial court business requiring federal oversight due to potential for local unrest. Each phrase was technically accurate while being fundamentally misleading. A masterclass in how corrupt officials could manipulate honest law enforcement by controlling the flow of information. Caldwell had positioned himself as the victim of potential mob violence rather than the perpetrator of systematic fraud. Has the judge provided documentation supporting these claims? Daniel asked carefully. All necessary paperwork has been filed through proper channels, the second official replied. He was younger than Hayes with the eager efficiency of someone climbing the federal bureaucratic ladder. Judge Caldwell's record of service to territorial development speaks for itself. Martha appeared on the cabin porch, drawn by the sound of multiple horses and official voices. Her face showed immediate understanding of what was happening, the kind of dread that came from recognizing the approach of legal machinery designed to destroy lives efficiently and legally. Mrs. Brennan, Marshal Hayes called out, touching his hat with professional courtesy. I regret the necessity, but federal law requires me to inform you that failure to appear for these proceedings will result in additional charges and immediate forfeiture of any claims to this property. Martha walked toward them with the dignity Daniel had come to admire, her spine straight and her expression controlled despite the fear he could see in her eyes. This was a woman who'd learned to face disaster without flinching, even when that disaster wore badges and carried federal authority. I understand, Marshal. Can you tell me what specific charges are being brought? Hayes consulted official documents with the careful attention of someone who understood the importance of procedural accuracy. Fraudulent homestead claims based on survey irregularities. Failure to maintain proper improvement requirements under territorial settlement law. Moral unfitness for child custody based on cohabitation arrangements that violate community standards. Each charge was a carefully crafted lie wrapped in legal language, designed to sound reasonable to federal officials who didn't have access to the truth behind Caldwell's accusations. The beauty of the strategy was its reliance on institutional trust in judicial authority, the assumption that a territorial judge wouldn't fabricate evidence or manipulate federal law enforcement. Furthermore, the younger official added with obvious satisfaction, there are questions about Mr. Stone's legal right to be present on this property, given his transient status and lack of documented relationship to the property owners. Daniel felt the familiar cold anger that had made him dangerous as a Texas Ranger, the controlled fury that came from watching bureaucratic power being used to destroy innocent people. But anger without strategy would only make the situation worse, playing directly into Caldwell's hands. Marshal Hayes, Daniel said carefully, I'd like to request a private conversation regarding some background information that might be relevant to these proceedings. Hayes studied Daniel's face, seeing something there that suggested law enforcement experience. What kind of background information? The kind that federal authorities in Texas have been interested in for several years. Information about Judge Harrison Caldwell's previous judicial service and the circumstances surrounding his departure from Texas jurisdiction. The change in Hayes's expression was immediate and significant. The mention of federal interest in prior judicial problems introduced complications that went far beyond simple territorial land disputes. This was exactly the kind of information that could transform routine legal proceedings into major federal investigation. Mr. Stone, are you claiming official knowledge of Judge Caldwell's background? I'm claiming personal knowledge based on my service as a Texas Ranger investigating territorial land fraud. Judge Caldwell fled Texas in 1884 to avoid federal charges related to systematic survey manipulation and judicial corruption. The words hung in the cold air like smoke from green wood, grid and impossible to ignore. Hayes and his companion exchanged glances that spoke of rapidly shifting priorities and the need for careful verification of explosive claims. These are serious allegations, Hayes said slowly. Do you have documentation to support them? I have enough documentation to justify federal investigation of Judge Caldwell's activities in this territory, activities that show remarkable similarity to the patterns that made him a fugitive from Texas justice. Martha stepped closer, her expression showing hope mixed with concern about the dangerous game Daniel was playing. Challenging Caldwell's legal assault required revealing information that would make Daniel a target for elimination, not just legal harassment. Sheriff Brennan cleared his throat with obvious discomfort. Marshal Hayes, if there are federal complications to these proceedings, maybe they should be postponed until proper investigation can be conducted. Sheriff's right, the younger official agreed, though his tone suggested disappointment rather than relief. We can't proceed with territorial court business if there are active federal concerns about the presiding judge's authority. Hayes was quiet for a long moment, weighing the implications of Daniel's claims against his instructions to support Judge Caldwell's legal proceedings. Finally, he reached a decision that would transform their situation completely. Mr. Stone, I'm going to need you to accompany me to Cheyenne for a full debriefing with federal authorities. Ms. Brennan, these proceedings are postponed pending federal review of jurisdictional questions. It was exactly what Daniel had hoped for and exactly what he'd feared. Federal attention would protect Martha and the girls from Caldwell's immediate legal assault, but it would also expose Daniel to scrutiny that could reveal the personal nature of his involvement. How long? Martha asked, her voice steady despite obvious concern about being separated from Daniel during this crisis. Depends on what federal authorities find when they review Mr. Stone's information, Hayes replied honestly. Could be days, could be weeks. But Mrs. Brennan, you should understand that if these allegations prove true, your family's legal troubles will disappear permanently. And if they prove false, she asked with the directness that marked her approach to difficult realities, then Mr. Stone will face federal charges for making false statements to federal officers, and Judge Caldwell's proceedings will resume with additional federal support. Daniel felt the weight of that possibility, the risk he was taking not just with his own freedom, but with Martha's faith in his judgment. But some gambles were worth taking when the alternative was watching good people be destroyed by corrupt power. Marshal, I'm ready to travel whenever you are, but I'd like a few minutes to speak privately with Mrs. Brennan about arrangements for the homestead while I'm gone. Hayes nodded with professional understanding. Take whatever time you need. This is going to be a long process, and personal arrangements matter. As the federal officers withdrew to give them privacy, Sheriff Brennan lingered with obvious internal conflict written across his weathered features. Daniel, he said quietly, using the familiar name for the first time, I hope you know what you're doing. Judge Caldwell's got connections reaching all the way to Washington, and he doesn't forgive people who cross him. Tom, I know exactly what I'm doing. Your brother died because he tried to fight Caldwell alone without backup or federal support. That's not going to happen again. Brennan's expression showed painful recognition of the truth behind Daniel's words. James always said someone would eventually stand up to Caldwell properly. I hope he was right, and I hope you're the man to do it. He mounted his horse and rode away without looking back, leaving Daniel and Martha alone in the snow, with the weight of decision and consequence settling around them like winter fog. You're taking a terrible risk, Martha said, her voice steady, but her eyes showing the strain of watching everything depend on factors beyond her control. Sometimes terrible risks are the only way to end terrible situations, Daniel replied. Caldwell's not going to stop with legal harassment. If we don't end this permanently, he'll keep escalating until someone gets hurt. Martha nodded slowly, understanding the logic even as she feared the possible consequences. What do I do while you're gone? How do I protect the girls if something goes wrong? Reverend Collins will help, and so will Tom Brennan. The community support you gained at church is real, and people will stand by you now that they've found their courage. He paused, looking toward the cabin, where Emma and Kate were probably wondering about the visitors and the serious conversations happening outside. But Martha, you need to understand something. If this goes wrong, if federal authorities don't believe my evidence, or if Caldwell's connections protect him, I might not be coming back. And Judge Caldwell will take his revenge on everyone who stood against him. Martha's jaw tightened with the determination he'd come to recognize as her response to impossible situations. Then we'd better make sure it doesn't go wrong. What do you need me to do? The ride to Cheyenne took 3 days through winter weather that tested both horses and riders. But Marshal Hayes proved to be competent company with a professional understanding of the stakes involved. During the long hours in the saddle, Daniel gradually revealed the scope of Judge Caldwell's criminal enterprise, providing enough detail to convince Hayes that federal intervention was not just warranted, but urgently necessary. The territorial capital was a bustling center of government and commerce, its broad streets lined with substantial buildings that spoke of federal investment in territorial ambitions. The federal courthouse dominated one end of the main street, its imposing architecture designed to project the authority and permanence of United States law in frontier territory. Federal Judge Robert Morrison proved to be exactly what Daniel had hoped for, a man whose integrity was matched by his intelligence and whose federal appointment made him immune to the kind of local pressure that had enabled Caldwell's decade-long crime spree. Morrison listened to Daniel's testimony with the careful attention of someone who understood that territorial corruption could undermine federal authority if left unchecked. "Mr. Stone," Morrison said, when Daniel finished his initial presentation, "these are extraordinary allegations against a sitting territorial judge. I trust you understand that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." "Your Honor, I understand completely. I've brought copies of all the documentation I assembled during the original Texas investigation, plus new evidence gathered during my time in Millbrook." Daniel spread the papers across the judge's massive oak desk, organizing them with the systematic precision that had made him an effective investigator. Survey maps showing systematic boundary alterations, financial records documenting suspicious land transactions, witness statements describing intimidation and suspicious deaths. Morrison studied each document with the methodical thoroughness that marked his judicial approach, occasionally asking pointed questions that demonstrated his understanding of both legal procedure and criminal methodology. "This Texas documentation is certainly damning," Morrison said finally, "but it's also 5 years old. What evidence do you have of continuing criminal activity in Wyoming territory?" Daniel produced the papers Judge Caldwell had served on Martha, pointing out specific language that revealed the scope of his current land fraud operation. These foreclosure documents claim debts to Silver Crown Mining Company that don't exist in any legitimate financial records. The survey irregularities mentioned here follow exactly the same pattern Caldwell used in Texas to steal mineral-rich land from homesteaders. He pulled out a hand-drawn map showing the Brennan property and surrounding claims. Judge Caldwell's been systematically acquiring land in a specific geographic pattern, targeting properties with minerals potential while using legal technicalities to justify the theft. The same methodology, the same careful documentation designed to make theft look like legitimate legal procedure. Morrison leaned back in his chair, his expression showing the kind of controlled anger that marked honest judges confronted with judicial corruption. "Mr. Stone, if these allegations prove accurate, Judge Caldwell has been conducting a criminal enterprise under cover of territorial law for over a decade. That represents a fundamental threat to federal authority and territorial development." "Your Honor, it's worse than simple theft. Judge Caldwell's been eliminating witnesses who could expose his operation. James Brennan died because he discovered evidence of survey fraud. There may be others. The implications of systematic murder under cover of judicial authority transform the case from complex fraud to federal conspiracy with implications reaching far beyond Wyoming territory." Morrison's expression showed recognition of the stakes involved. "Marshal Hayes," Morrison said, turning to address the federal officer who'd remained silent during the presentation, "I want you to return to Millbrook immediately with a team of federal investigators. Secure all court records related to Judge Caldwell's land decisions, and place him under federal protective custody pending completion of this investigation." "Protective custody, Your Honor?" "If Mr. Stone's allegations are accurate, Judge Caldwell represents both a flight risk and a potential target for elimination by people who might prefer to avoid federal investigation of their own involvement in his operations." Morrison's strategic thinking impressed Daniel. By framing Caldwell's arrest as protection rather than accusation, Morrison could prevent the flight that had ended the Texas investigation while gathering evidence that would make conviction inevitable. Your Honor, Daniel said carefully, there's one more thing you should know. Judge Caldwell believes I'm conducting some kind of official federal investigation. He's expecting federal intervention, which means he's probably already planning his response. What kind of response? The same kind he used in Texas. Eliminate the evidence, eliminate the witnesses, and disappear before federal authorities can piece together what happened. Morrison's expression darkened with understanding. Marshal Hayes' change of plans. Take a full federal team to Millbrook tonight, travel hard, and arrest Judge Caldwell on federal charges of conspiracy to defraud the United States government. No protective custody, no advance warning. Full federal arrest with immediate transport to Cheyenne for arraignment. Hayes nodded with professional satisfaction. This was the kind of clear mission that federal officers preferred. Definite targets, specific charges, uncomplicated objectives. What about the local situation? Sheriff, townspeople, potential witnesses? Secure the courthouse and all official records. Interview witnesses separately to prevent coordination of stories. And Marshal, make absolutely certain that Mrs. Brennan and her daughters are protected during this operation. They're the primary witnesses to Judge Caldwell's current criminal activity. Daniel felt relief mixed with continued concern. Federal intervention would end Caldwell's reign of corruption, but the transition period could be dangerous for everyone who'd stood against him. Your Honor, may I return with Marshal Hayes? Mrs. Brennan and her daughters trust me, and my presence might help keep the situation calm during the arrests. Morrison considered the request, weighing the potential benefits against the risks of involving a civilian in federal law enforcement operations. Mr. Stone, you understand that returning to Millbrook means testifying publicly about your allegations. Judge Caldwell's defense attorneys will attack your credibility, your motives, your personal relationship with Mrs. Brennan. I understand, Your Honor, but some things are worth the risk to your reputation. Morrison smiled with the kind of approval that marked his recognition of genuine courage. Very well. Marshal Hayes, Mr. Stone accompanies your team as a federal witness under protective custody. And gentlemen, remember that we're not just conducting a criminal investigation. We're demonstrating that federal law applies equally to everyone, regardless of local position or political connections. The next 18 hours passed in a blur of preparation and travel that tested both horses and riders. Hayes's federal team included 6 experienced marshals, a territorial court clerk empowered to secure official documents, and a stenographer to record witness statements. They were the kind of competent professionals that gave Daniel confidence in the federal justice system when it functioned properly. The return journey to Millbrook was accomplished in record time, aided by clear weather and the kind of focused urgency that marked important federal operations. As they approached the town, Daniel felt the familiar tension that preceded dangerous law enforcement actions, the heightened awareness that came from knowing that the next few hours would determine success or catastrophic failure. Judge Caldwell's house sat on a low hill overlooking the town, its substantial architecture designed to project authority and permanence. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and lamplight in several windows suggested that the household was active despite the early evening hour. Standard federal arrest procedure, Hayes instructed his team as they deployed around the property. Simultaneous entry through front and rear, secure all occupants, prevent destruction of evidence. Mr. Stone, you remain with me and observe only. No participation in the actual arrest. The arrest itself was anticlimactic in the way of well-planned law enforcement operations. Judge Caldwell answered the door with the confidence of someone expecting social visitors, his expression shifting from surprise to fury to calculation as he realized what was happening. Federal Marshals, Judge Caldwell, you're under arrest on charges of conspiracy to defraud the United States government, mail fraud, and violation of federal land settlement laws. Caldwell's response was immediate and predictable. This is outrageous. I demand to know the authority for this arrest, the specific charges, the evidence supporting federal jurisdiction. All questions will be answered during your arraignment in federal court, Hayes replied, with professional calm. Right now, you need to come with us quietly and allow my team to secure potential evidence related to these charges. But Daniel could see something dangerous in Caldwell's expression. the look of a cornered animal calculating desperate options. The judge's eyes found Daniel among the federal officers, and recognition flashed across his features. "Daniel Stone," Caldwell said, with the kind of controlled fury that marked genuinely dangerous men. "I should have recognized you earlier. Still playing Texas Ranger in territories where you have no authority." "Judge Caldwell, you're required to come with us immediately," Hayes interrupted. But Caldwell continued to focus on Daniel with undisguised hatred. "You have no idea what you've started here, Stone. No idea how many people's lives you're about to destroy by interfering in matters that don't concern you." The threat was unmistakable, delivered with the confidence of someone who believed he still had cards to play. Daniel realized that Caldwell's apparent resignation was actually calculation, the strategic thinking of someone who'd survived one federal investigation and believed he could survive another. As the federal team escorted Caldwell to the waiting transport wagon, Daniel caught a glimpse of the judge's wife watching from an upstairs window. Her expression showed neither surprise nor distress, but rather the careful neutrality of someone who'd been expecting this development and had made her own preparations accordingly. The courthouse search revealed exactly what Daniel had expected: years of carefully documented fraud disguised as legitimate legal proceedings, file cabinets full of altered survey documents, financial records showing systematic theft disguised as court fees and administrative costs, correspondence with mining companies that revealed the scope of the conspiracy. But as the federal team cataloged evidence, Daniel felt a growing unease. Everything was too convenient, too easily discovered, as if Judge Caldwell had wanted federal investigators to find this particular collection of documents. "Marshal Hayes," he said quietly, "this feels wrong. Caldwell's too smart to leave this much evidence in obvious locations. This might be misdirection, designed to focus federal attention on financial crimes while hiding something worse." Hayes paused in his examination of court records, his professional instincts alerted by Daniel's concern. "What kind of something worse?" "Murder. Caldwell's killed people to protect his operation, but I don't see any evidence related to those crimes. If he's prepared for federal investigation, he's probably destroyed anything that could connect him to actual violence, while preserving evidence of financial crimes that carry lighter sentences." The implication was chilling. Judge Caldwell might be planning to plead guilty to fraud charges in exchange for immunity from murder prosecution, gambling that federal authorities would accept a victory on paper rather than pursuing justice for his victims. "Mr. Stone, if you're right about this strategy, we need to find evidence of the violent crimes before Caldwell's attorneys can negotiate a plea bargain that excludes the rest of them." Daniel nodded grimly. "Which means we need to talk to people who knew James Brennan, find witnesses who can testify about the circumstances of his death and any other suspicious accidents that might have been murders." The investigation was far from over, but at least now it was being conducted by people with the authority and resources to pursue justice regardless of local political complications. Judge Caldwell's decade-long reign of corruption was ending, but ending it completely would require careful work and considerable courage from people who'd been afraid to speak truth for far too long. 6 months after Judge Harrison Caldwell's federal conviction on conspiracy charges, spring had transformed both the Wyoming landscape and the lives of everyone his corruption had touched. The man who'd terrorized an entire territory with legal manipulation and systematic violence was serving a 20-year sentence in federal prison. His criminal empire dismantled by investigators who'd traced connections reaching across multiple territories and into the halls of territorial government itself. Daniel Stone stood at the fence line he'd repaired on Christmas morning, watching Emma and Kate chase butterflies through meadow grass that had grown tall enough to hide their small bodies when they crouched to examine some fascinating discovery. Their laughter carried across the distance, bright and pure, and full of the kind of unguarded joy that children brought to simple pleasures when they felt completely safe. The transformation of the homestead itself was remarkable, but not as significant as the transformation of the people who lived there. The cabin bore fresh whitewash that gleamed in the morning sunlight. New windows sparkled with glass that had been carefully transported from Cheyenne, and the barn had been enlarged to accommodate the growing herd of cattle that had made their small ranch genuinely prosperous. But the most profound changes couldn't be measured in buildings or livestock or improved infrastructure. They lived in the way Emma ran toward him without hesitation when she needed comfort or help, in the way Kate showed him her nature drawings with quiet pride and complete trust, in the way Martha smiled when she watched him teaching the girls to identify animal tracks or properly care for horses. The word family had regained its meaning gradually, earned through shared work and common purpose, and the daily choice to stay when staying required courage. Daniel had learned that love wasn't something you lost forever when death claimed the people who first taught you its value. It was something you could discover again, in new places, with new people, if you were brave enough to risk having your heart broken twice. The legal resolution of Judge Caldwell's case had brought more than just justice for past crimes. The federal investigation had uncovered systematic corruption involving territorial officials, mining companies, and land development schemes that had stolen millions of acres from legitimate homesteaders across the Western Territories. Daniel's testimony had been crucial to the prosecution's success, but it had also established his credentials for the position the territorial governor had offered him: chief territorial investigator for land fraud, with federal authority to pursue corruption cases across multiple territorial boundaries. It was work that mattered, work that protected honest people from the kind of systematic theft that had nearly destroyed Martha's family. More importantly, it was work that allowed him to travel when necessary while maintaining his home base at the ranch that had become the center of his rebuilt life. "Papa Daniel," Emma called from the meadow, using the title she'd assigned him without asking permission or waiting for official confirmation. The name honored James Brennan's memory while acknowledging Daniel's role in their lives, a perfect solution to the complexity of blended family relationships. Daniel smiled, the expression coming naturally now rather than fighting its way past years of protective, emotional numbness. Papa Daniel, not Daddy, which belonged to James Brennan's legacy, but something new and different and entirely his own. He walked through the tall grass to where the girls were examining something in the wildflower patch. "Papa Daniel, look what we found," Emma called out excitedly. Kate held up a perfectly formed bird's nest that had fallen from a nearby tree. "It's empty now, but see how carefully it was built?" Daniel examined the nest, noting the intricate weaving of grass and small twigs. "Your father would have appreciated this kind of craftsmanship." "Like his wooden horses," Kate said softly. "Like his wooden horses," Daniel agreed. Martha's voice called from the cabin announcing that lunch was ready, and the girls jumped up with the quick energy that marked their transition from one interesting activity to the next. They raced toward the cabin with plans for afternoon adventures involving the wooden horses their father had carved, their voices carrying across the meadow with the kind of elaborate storytelling that turns simple play into epic narratives. Daniel followed more slowly, savoring the simple pleasure of walking through grass that belonged to his family, toward a home where his presence was valued rather than merely tolerated. The drawing the girls had given him on Christmas morning was now framed and hanging above the mantelpiece, its childish stick figures representing something that had become profound reality. Three people holding hands, representing connection and commitment and the kind of love that chose to stay when staying required courage. Martha met him at the cabin door, wiping her hands on an apron that showed the comfortable stains of daily cooking. Her face had changed dramatically over the months, the lines of exhaustion and constant worry replaced by expressions of contentment and hope, and the kind of deep satisfaction that came from building something worth keeping. The legal victory over Judge Caldwell had restored more than just their property rights. It had returned Martha's faith in justice, her belief that good people could prevail against corruption when they found the courage to stand together. The community support that had emerged during the church confrontation had grown into genuine friendships and business relationships that made their ranch part of a larger network of mutual assistance and shared prosperity. "What were they so excited about this time?" Martha asked, watching Emma and Kate wash their hands at the basin with the careful attention that marked important discoveries. "A bird's nest. Kate found it in the wildflower patch. Perfectly woven, probably fell from that old oak tree. Smart girl. Takes after her mother that way." Daniel caught Martha's hand as she moved past him, drawing her close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used and feel the warmth of her skin through the thin fabric of her dress. 6 months of shared responsibility and growing intimacy had taught him to treasure these moments of quiet connection, the simple pleasure of touching someone who welcomed his presence completely. "What about Emma?" he asked, enjoying the familiar ritual of their daily conversations about the girl's development and achievements. Martha's smile carried the kind of private humor that marked comfortable domestic relationships. "Emma takes after her new father, all enthusiasm and protective instincts and absolute certainty that problems exist to be solved rather than endured." New father. The words still carried emotional weight that made Daniel's chest tight with feelings he was learning to trust rather than fear. Not replacement father, which would have dishonored James Brennan's memory, but something original and precious and entirely his own. Lunch was a comfortable affair, with conversation that ranged from the girls' plans for a summer garden to Daniel's upcoming investigation of land fraud in Colorado Territory to Martha's latest project, a quilt she was making from fabric scraps that told the story of their first year as a reconstructed family. Each piece of fabric represented something specific. Blue from the dress she'd worn to Christmas church service, brown from Daniel's old shirt that had been too damaged to mend after a particularly difficult arrest, red from ribbons the girls had received as gifts from neighbors who'd become genuine friends again after years of uncomfortable distance. After the meal, while Emma and Kate settled in for their afternoon rest, Daniel and Martha sat on the porch they'd built together during the spring building season. They watched the meadow grass move in the warm breeze while discussing improvements that would make the ranch even more comfortable and profitable. The cattle operation had exceeded all expectations, partly due to Daniel's connections with honest buyers in Cheyenne, and partly due to Martha's natural head for business. She'd proven to have analytical thinking that turned ranching from mere subsistence survival into genuine prosperity. The kind of success that created options rather than just meeting necessities. "The Territorial Land Commissioner wants to meet with you next week," Martha said, consulting the notebook where she kept track of Daniel's increasingly complex professional obligations. "Something about standardizing survey procedures across all the Western territories." "That's important work," Daniel replied, though his tone suggested mixed feelings about extended travel. Standardized surveys would prevent the kind of fraud Caldwell used to steal land from homesteaders. But it would also mean more time away from home, more separation from the girls during their important developmental years. Daniel nodded, acknowledging the tension between professional duty and personal commitment that marked his new life. The work mattered enormously, protecting countless families from the kind of systematic theft that had nearly destroyed their own. But Emma and Kate needed stability and consistency, the kind of reliable presence that could help them recover from the trauma of losing one father and adjust to gaining another. "Maybe we could arrange it differently," Martha suggested, with the kind of practical problem-solving that marked her approach to complicated situations. "The girls are old enough to travel safely, and they'd benefit from seeing more of the territory. We could make some of these trips into family expeditions." The idea had obvious appeal, combining Daniel's professional responsibilities with family time while giving Emma and Kate educational experiences that would broaden their understanding of the world beyond their immediate community. "Think they'd enjoy seeing Denver and Colorado Springs?" Daniel asked, warming to the possibility. "I think they'd enjoy going anywhere with you," Martha replied honestly. "You've become their security, their certainty that adults can be trusted to keep their promises and protect them from harm." The responsibility was enormous but welcome, the kind of burden that gave life meaning and purpose beyond individual survival. Daniel had learned that being trusted by children was perhaps the most serious responsibility an adult could accept, requiring constant attention to the example being set and the lessons being taught through daily action. As afternoon deepened toward evening, they were joined on the porch by Sheriff Tom Brennan, who'd become a regular visitor since accepting the position of Deputy Territorial Investigator under Daniel's supervision. Tom's knowledge of local conditions and family connections made him invaluable for investigating corruption cases, while his personal investment in justice for his brother's murder made him completely trustworthy. "Evening, folks," Tom said as he tied his horse to the fence post and walked toward the porch with the easy familiarity of extended family. "Hope you don't mind an unexpected visitor, but I've got news that couldn't wait for tomorrow." "What kind of news?" Daniel asked, noting the combination of satisfaction and concern in Tom's expression. "Federal marshals arrested the territorial court clerk this morning. Turns out he'd been selling advance information about federal investigations to the same criminal network that supported Caldwell's operation." The news was significant, but not entirely surprising. Judge Caldwell's conviction had revealed connections to a territorial corruption network that reached far beyond Wyoming, involving mining companies, land development schemes, and territorial officials across multiple jurisdictions. How much information did he sell? Martha asked, understanding immediately that leaked intelligence could compromise ongoing investigations and endanger witnesses. Enough to warn several targets about federal attention, but not enough to prevent most of the arrests we'd planned. The clerk only had access to general investigation plans, not specific evidence or witness identities. Daniel felt relief mixed with continued vigilance. Corruption networks were like weeds, requiring constant attention to prevent regeneration. Each arrested official provided information about other participants, creating an expanding web of investigation that could take years to complete. What about our situation specifically? Martha asked with the directness that marked her approach to potential threats to her family's security. You're safe, Tom assured her immediately. Judge Caldwell's appeals have been rejected at every level, and he's not getting out of federal prison anytime soon. The criminal network he was part of has been too badly damaged to pose ongoing threats to individual witnesses. Emma and Kate appeared on the porch, drawn by the sound of Uncle Tom's voice and the prospect of adult conversation that might include interesting stories about law enforcement adventures. They settled on either side of Daniel with the comfortable assumption of children who felt completely secure in their family relationships. Uncle Tom, Emma said with the bright curiosity that marked her approach to most adult activities, are you catching more bad men today? Not today, sweetheart. Today, I'm just visiting family and making sure everyone's safe and happy. We're very safe, Kate added with the serious tone she brought to important topics. Papa Daniel teaches us about watching for danger, and Mama teaches us about taking care of each other. Tom smiled with genuine warmth at the girls' confidence and security, understanding how remarkable their recovery had been considering the trauma they'd experienced during Caldwell's reign of terror. That's exactly what families should do, he agreed. Take care of each other and watch out for danger while building something good together. As evening approached and Tom prepared to return to town, he pulled Daniel aside for a private conversation that had obviously been planned rather than spontaneous. Daniel, there's something else you should know. The territorial governor wants to offer you the position of Chief U.S. Marshal for Wyoming Territory when it achieves statehood next year. The offer was remarkable recognition of Daniel's successful work cleaning up territorial corruption, but it was also a significant decision point that would affect his entire family's future. That's a hell of an honor, Tom, but it's also a hell of a responsibility that would require even more travel and dangerous work. It would also mean the authority and resources to prevent another Judge Caldwell from terrorizing honest people, the kind of position that could make a real difference for countless families. Daniel looked toward the cabin where Martha was helping the girls prepare for bed, their voices carrying through the open windows with the comfortable rhythm of domestic routine. This life they'd built together was precious beyond measure, worth protecting from anything that might threaten its stability. But the work itself was important too, protecting other families from the kind of systematic corruption that had nearly destroyed their own. The tension between personal happiness and public service was real and complex, requiring careful consideration of multiple factors and competing obligations. Tom, I appreciate the governor's confidence, but I need to discuss this with Martha before making any decisions. Family comes first, and major career changes affect everyone who depends on stability and security. Tom nodded with complete understanding. Of course, take whatever time you need. But Daniel, remember that some opportunities don't come twice, and some positions allow good men to accomplish things that matter beyond their personal circumstances. Daniel looked toward the cabin where Martha and the girls were preparing supper, their voices carrying through the open windows with the comfortable rhythm of family life. Then he turned back to Tom with a slight smile. Actually, Tom, I don't need more time. I'll accept the position, but with conditions. My family travels with me when the work allows it, and this ranch remains our permanent home base. Some routes run too deep to abandon. Tom grinned broadly. I think the territorial governor will find those terms very reasonable. Congratulations, Marshal Stone. After Tom departed, Daniel rejoined Martha and the girls for their evening routine. Emma showed him a drawing she'd completed of the ranch as seen from the meadow, including the expanded barn and improved fences, and what appeared to be approximately 50 cattle scattered across the pasture. Her artistic skills had improved dramatically over the months, encouraged by praise and art supplies that were no longer luxury items, but standard parts of a household budget that could afford such things. Kate shared her latest pressed flower specimens, carefully preserved between the pages of a book Martha had given her for documenting the changing seasons. Each flower was labeled in her meticulous handwriting, with notes about when and where it had been found and what weather conditions had been present during collection. "This is the morning cloak butterfly flower," she said, showing them a purple blossom that had been perfectly preserved. "I want to remember exactly what it looked like when we found it together this morning." "That's a wonderful idea," Daniel said seriously. "Some discoveries are too important to trust to memory alone." Martha's hand found his as they sat watching their daughters share their daily discoveries. The simple gesture carrying the weight of shared understanding and mutual support. They'd found something worth preserving through any challenge, worth protecting against any threat, worth building an entire life around. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that made everything look touched by magic. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its liquid notes into the gathering dusk, and closer to home, the creek murmured its constant song of water moving toward destinations unknown. Peace. The word had become reality through careful tending and daily choice, and the gradual understanding that happiness wasn't something you found accidentally, but something you built deliberately, one decision at a time. Daniel Stone had ridden into their lives on Christmas morning as a broken man running from ghosts and expecting nothing more than temporary shelter from a blizzard. He discovered instead what he'd been seeking without knowing he was searching for it: a place to belong, people to protect, work that mattered, and love that was worth the risk of losing everything to keep. The fence gate stood open in the gathering darkness, no longer a barrier but an invitation, no longer keeping anyone out, but welcoming home anyone brave enough to stay when staying required courage and faith, and the willingness to build something lasting from the fragments of broken dreams. Some men spent their whole lives searching for home, riding through endless miles in empty towns, looking for something they'd lost or never quite found. Others discovered it waiting at a fence line, wrapped in two small voices saying please, offered by a woman strong enough to share her burdens and generous enough to share her blessings with someone who'd forgotten he was worthy of both. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and fresh opportunities, decisions about career advancement and family priorities and the balance between public service and private happiness. But tonight there was this: a family gathered on a porch, watching stars emerge in a darkening sky, grateful for what they'd found and confident in what they were building together. The morning cloak butterfly had found its way to exactly where it belonged, and so had Daniel Stone. The fence gate stood open, welcoming whatever the future might bring.